Frodo groaned, but with a great effort of will he staggered up, and then he fell upon his knees again. He raised his eyes to the dark slopes of Mount Doom towering above him, and then pitifully he began to crawl forward on his hands. Sam looked at him and wept in his heart, but no tears came to his dry and stinging eyes. "I said I'd carry him if it broke my back," he muttered. "And I will. Come, Mr. Frodo," he cried. "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you, and it as well." Good morrow, ladies and gentlemen. My name is The Advocate, and today I'm finally an advocate for Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, a book review. Written by J.R.R. Tolkien and released on October 20, 1955, The Return of the King serves as the climactic conclusion to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Does this book wrap up the series on a high note? Well, before we answer that question, if you guys could do me a huge favor and hit that like button, drop a comment down below, and consider joining this fellowship by subscribing to my channel. It really does help me out in beating the YouTube algorithm. Also, while you're at it, feel free to check out some of the other videos that I have on this channel where we talk about the previous Lord of the Rings books. In fact, I encourage that because if you couldn't already guess by this video's intro, this video will contain full series spoilers, including spoilers for Return of the King. So if you haven't read Return of the King yet, now's the time to bookmark this video and come back to it after you finish this book. Okay, let's go! So this may or may not sound like a hot take, but after reading all 3 books in the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the singular entry in The Hobbit, I found Return of the King to be my least favorite novel of Tolkien's Middle-earth series. Now, I don't mean that to sound like I'm disparaging this book in any way. No, I very much still enjoyed Return of the King and thought it to be a worthy conclusion to this trilogy. However, as I was reading this book, I found myself struggling through significant portions of this book, and it definitely dampened my excitement for this conclusion. Return of the King's first half, i.e., Book 5, is, in my subjective opinion, a less engaging story than what I've come to expect from this series. Rather than continuing the story from where we left off with Frodo and Sam at the end of Two Towers, Tolkien instead elects to hop our perspective back to the remaining members of the Fellowship as they prepare to, and consequently, do battle with Sauron's forces in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Now, there's nothing wrong with following these other characters' perspectives. However, I personally found the sequence of events surrounding them to not be all that interesting, and that predominantly boils down to the fact that, again, in my opinion, I find the crowded cast of characters here in Book 5 to not be as interesting as Frodo and Sam. Eowyn, Eomer, Theoden, Denethor, all these characters which we have been previously introduced to in Two Towers are, personally, somewhat lacking in depth. I mean, I know their general character traits and their alliance within the Great War of the Ring, but I don't really know much about them beyond their base personalities. Whether it's because of limited page time or just a general lack of significant character development, I found it difficult to become invested in these characters for the most part, and it's due to this lack of investment with these characters that I ultimately found myself not being drawn to a lot of the battle scenes they participate in. So much so that, as horrible as it sounds, I wasn't particularly emotional when Theoden died in battle. Definitely let me know in the comment section down below if I'm being too out of line or too cynical with these characters. It also doesn't help that in this Battle of Pelennor Fields, the main number 1 enemy here, the Nazgul, are, intentionally so, largely one-dimensional antagonists that predominantly serve as cannon fodder. There's no Saruman level of nuance here, it's just bad guys defending bad boss so they can do bad things. Now, it's perfectly valid for Tolkien to have a flat group of villains within his story. After all, it makes it significantly easier for the reader to empathize with the good guys when the bad guys are unthinking, ugly lunks. But it does slightly limit our scope of interest for these battles when we don't much care for the bad guys and are primarily focused on seeing how our group of good guys will survive. What we see here is essentially what we get. But I know these critiques speak largely more about my own personal preferences with regards to what I enjoy in fantasy, as opposed to any potential faults within the text itself. I happen to be a reader who prefers deep character studies within the confines of an intimate cast of characters, as opposed to still well-developed but not quite as developed characters engaging in loud, bombastic battles. I just think it's worth pointing out that, at least when it comes to Book 5 of this story, I wasn't totally on board with Tolkien's storytelling style, and that unfortunately affected my initial experience with this book. However, to that effect, there is a lot to appreciate narratively about Book 5 that I think is worthy of praise. Despite my complaints about Denethor not being a very well-rounded character, his attempted burning of Faramir at the stake makes for an impactful scene, especially as it draws an exclamation point on Gandalf and Denethor's mini-rivalry, with Denethor ultimately committing suicide as he allows himself to be consumed by despair. The scene also functions to add a seal of badassery to Gandalf's character when he busts down Denethor's door and saves Faramir from a burning death. Man, that wizard can never have too many awesome OP moments. Our main man Strider takes a big step in his character arc as he finally reveals himself to be Aragorn, King of Gondor, and uses his healing powers to wake some of the fallen soldiers, including Éowyn, in a rather touching scene. And despite being considered the lesser important hobbits of the story, Merry and Pippin shed their carefree personalities and punch above their weight in order to become battle-hardened soldiers ready for war. There are certainly elements to this part of the book where, although the general characters and layout aren't exactly to my liking, I can't deny that the story surrounding it has some pretty cool and amazing moments. Compositionally as well, Tolkien's prose continues to be a thing of beauty as he crafts language in an almost poetic fashion in order to enhance the imagery without having to use an overabundance of descriptive adjectives. I think the best example of this is Gandalf's confrontation with the captain of the Nazgul, where, again, in another moment of badassery, Gandalf stands firm against this ominous creature and Tolkien inundates the reader in a tense sense of ambiance. In rode the Lord of the Nazgul, a great black shape against the fires beyond he loomed up, grown to a vast menace of despair. In rode the Lord of the Nazgul, under the archway that no enemy ever yet had passed, and all fled before his face. All save one. There, waiting silent and still in the space before the gate, sat Gandalf upon Shadowfax. Shadowfax, who alone among the free horses of the earth endured the terror, unmoving, steadfast as a graven image in the Rath Dinnan. "You cannot enter here," said Gandalf, and the huge shadow halted. "Go back to the abyss prepared for you. Go back! Fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master. Go!" The Black Rider flung back his hood, and behold, he had a kingly crown, and yet upon no head visible was it set. The red fires shone between it and the mantled shoulders vast and dark. From a mouth unseen, there came a deadly laughter. However, beyond the descriptions of war and characters engaging in battle, the real central tenet of this story continues to be the theme of friendship. And there's no better representation of that friendship than Frodo and Sam, especially as they rely on each other to get them through their harrowing gauntlet into Mount Doom. Similar to the Two Towers, Frodo and Sam are absent from this book's first half, so we don't really get to see what happens to them following the events of Shelob's Lair until Book 6. But once we get to that point, oh boy, we are immersed in some fantastic character moments and quite possibly my favorite stretch in all of fantasy literature. The foremost moment being the climactic incident where Sam, being a real MVP and best friend beyond belief, hoists a drained Frodo Baggins over his shoulder and carries him up a fiery mountain so that Frodo can finally fulfill his long-awaited goal of destroying that disgusting ring. It's fantastic. This moment serves as a perfect literary payoff for Sam and Frodo's journey up to this point. Prior to this moment, the ring has slowly been sapping Frodo's life force, and Sam has had to play protector for Frodo with increasing regularity. For all this to come to a head with Frodo no longer able to walk and Sam feeling the strongest call to action he's ever felt in the series, it's a perfectly built up to moment. This also leads to one of my favorite twists in all of fiction, and that's when right at the precipice of Mount Doom, as Frodo dangles the ring off the edge of the mountain as he's finally about to release that thing into the lava, Frodo succumbs to the power of the ring and puts it around his finger instead. Oof, that Tolkien, what a tease, man. By the way, side note, a lot of people often talk about how Frodo is such a weak character and oh my gosh, how could you risk humanity at the very last second, you worthless little bee? And all I gotta say to that is, bro, quit smoking crack. Frodo walked with that ring for 6 months. You wouldn't last 6 seconds with that thing. But more importantly, Frodo yielding to the power of the ring not only provides a tense subversion of expectations, but also pays off the ring's oft-discussed Chekhov's ability to manipulate the people who hold it. Yes, we've seen glimpses of the ring's temptation through Boromir, and the end result of what the ring's dominance looks like via Gollum's disfigured appearance. But seeing the seductions of the ring in real time as it gradually takes hold of Frodo until this pivotal moment feels like a well-earned payoff. Despite the fact that, this payoff is not exactly good for our heroes. But that doesn't matter, because in the end, Gollum, Sam's #1 enemy, sneaks back into the foray, bites Frodo's finger off to reclaim the ring, a full-circle character journey for him. Good on him for finally reclaiming what he lost all the way back in the Hobbit book. He dances his Pyrrhic victory dance, and then falls off the cliff into the lava below, thus permanently ending his character arc and the central MacGuffin of this story for good. Now, to some readers, I'm sure Gollum's death is a little underwhelming, especially when we compare it to the movie's version where it's a tussle with Frodo that officially pushes Gollum off into the lava. But I think there's an appropriate level of schadenfreude involved in seeing Gollum's extended jubilation be the cause of his own demise. There's also a level of irony involved in the fact that this ring, which was purposely created by Sauron to ensnare man, was also ultimately Sauron's undoing, as it was said ensnaring of Gollum as he danced his little dance that caused the ring to fall into the lava and usher Sauron's end. Just desserts. Tastes so good. So the ring is destroyed, the Nazgul run away, and our heroes save the day. Woo! End of story. Or so many readers would like to believe, but it is here where our extended epilogue begins and where a lot of fans grow divided on this book's ending. The general consensus seems to be that this book's epilogue feels too drawn out and sometimes unnecessary. And I mean, yeah, I can partially understand this, as there's parts of this epilogue which I do think do drag a bit, such as Éowyn and Faramir's courtship, and I'm not a total fan of all the celebratory events we get here at the end of the book, but once we get past those and on to the walk back to the Shire, I actually enjoyed this postscript very much, more so than I did the battle scenes back in Book 5. Delving back into the Schadenfreude topic, I absolutely love how Saruman is essentially reduced to just a powerless wandering nobody who attempts to stir up what little trouble he can, only to, in the end, be mauled by hobbits and subsequently die a pitiful yet appropriate death. Peter Jackson, the executive producer of the Lord of the Rings movies, called Saruman's book death anticlimactic. And I'm sorry, Mr. Jackson, but I gotta disagree with you, as although the cinematic version of Saruman's death does have its merits, I actually like the book's version of events better, as there's a certain amount of poetry in seeing this once powerful wizard be slain by something so utilitarian as Wormtongue's kitchen knife. His literary death is a more accurate reflection of his fall from grace, and is in my opinion a more interesting way for Saruman to go when compared to the movie. On top of that, it also shows how much our Hobbit characters have grown over the course of these 3 books, as it is our battle-hardened hobbits who are the first to raise their weapons in defense of the Shire against our pathetic Sharky/Saruman, and it is also our hobbit friends, especially Frodo, who in the end, after everything is done, show signs of very realistic PTSD because after such a harrowing journey, why wouldn't they feel anguished? It's a very poetic end to a poetic story. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. For the first time in my life, I have finally read and completed all of Tolkien's written works, for the most part, within his Middle-earth series. And despite some subjective hiccups that I had with this last book, I gotta say that, all in all, I thought Lord of the Rings was very worthy of its legendary status as peak fantasy, and quite possibly one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written. I am so happy to have finally read these books, and I'm so happy that you guys stuck around with me to watch me ramble about these books. Thank you guys. A combination of immersive world building, beautiful prose, and the simple yet engaging premise makes Lord of the Rings an unforgettable series, and it's no wonder so many authors have tried to copy the template established by this series. If you're a fantasy fan or an enjoyer of fiction in general, this series is definitely a must-read. So I know likely the number one question I'm going to get now is, so Advocate, are you going to read the Silmarillion next? And that's a very fair question to ask. But to be honest, I think I'm going to hold off on reading that book until a later time. Despite what my previous read-through of J.R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood may imply, I'm actually not that big of a fan of fictional historical compendiums. However, if there is significant demand from you guys for me to read that book, then I may double back on that and read this book. But for now, we'll play it by ear and see what happens. But until then, thank you all so very much for your love and support, and I hope to see you guys next time for a new series. The Advocate, out.